I think I just want to say that, and I'm sure this will come up again during the questions, that the university is extremely attentive, as you might imagine, to the student experience, always has been, but even more so in the current circumstances. And that means that we're trying to put in place a lot of things at once. Some of those have come online already, some haven't. So we have the Leamington space, which is online. We have the Roots grid coming up. We have the new gym, a whole series of these kind of things which will appear this year, actually in the time that people are here. And then of course we've got plenty of plans for the future as well. So, who wants to start?
Start with the board.
Yeah, well, I know when you joined the university that one of the things you said in terms of your aims for the future of the university was to get Warwick into the top 50 of the world rankings, and I know we've gone down this year to 58. What would you say about moving forward again?
Well, I think the danger you face, of course, in saying things like that is always that there's a league table somewhere that doesn't have you there, and there's a league table that does. And there's remarkably little that we can do except to keep plugging on. But what's absolutely evident is that the university has been improving in quite strong ways. So you're right, we went down in the QS league table from 50 to 58 on the basis basically of a small, tiny change in our staff-student ratio. That's it. That's the only thing that changed in the 6 indicators they used. But then the Times Higher Ed table, which we've had more than a few difficulties with, we went up 33 places this year. So that gives you some sense of the issues with league tables, swings and roundabouts most of the time. On the national league tables, we're firmly in the top 10. So we've got to keep going on that, and we're doing lots and lots and lots to make sure that these things happen.
You mentioned NSS, and we received quite some, I'd say, poor scores regarding feedback on work. The union are claiming that they secured a victory in getting a four-week feedback time. Is that your version of events, and how is this going to be enforced, and why do you think the university is scoring so low on feedback scores?
Of course, the university did a little less well this year than last, from 88 to 87. But actually did rather well on some of the scores, learning resources and these kinds of things. The problem we've got, as you quite rightly say, is feedback and assessment. Now, I don't talk in terms of issues like victories and battles and things like that, because that's not the relationship we think we have with the students. What we've tried to do, having said that, is move towards getting more satisfactory feedback and assessment scores. Why are we doing that? Because that's what the students clearly want. And so as a part of that, the new student community charter is precisely about us saying we will get 4-week turnaround for all assessed work. Now, of course, in some cases people will be doing it quicker than that, and in fact in many cases they already do.
The licence of the London Metropolitan University to sponsor students from outside the EU has been revoked. What impact do you think this has on the presence of international students at all universities?
I've got concerns mainly about London universities, interestingly. We've already seen and know that, for example, some press in the world can't tell the difference between universities with London in the title. They find that quite challenging, in fact. And the result is that all London universities are in danger of getting, the same issue attached to them, and we have to be very, very careful about that. It's going to cause the universities difficulties, but we don't know how much. So, for example, this last year, our overseas student numbers didn't go down at all. In fact, just a teensy increase. So we can't tell at the moment, but we're obviously concerned that there may be an impact. There has been in other universities in the UK, but it's the universities, how can I put this, who are less well known that are having the biggest impacts. More generally, I think there's every reason why a government should be able to enforce a particular kind of immigration policy. And it would be difficult to find a country in the world that didn't do that. At the same time, this particular immigration policy, I don't think is one which is particularly sensible. So we'll have to see exactly what happens. Frankly, your guess is as good as mine. It's pretty difficult to know that, but we're clearly prepared.
The Alan Milburn report recommended that universities generally do more to enable that students from lower economic backgrounds have a fair chance of getting into university. Now, this university says that it already does enough to ensure students from lower economic backgrounds have an equal chance of getting in, talking about things like the scholarships and bursaries you already provide. Can you explain more fully how those scholarships and bursaries ensure that access to Warwick is fair? And comment on what the university has had to say about the report more generally?
I think the first thing to say is that when you said this university has said it's doing enough, I'm not quite sure I remember that that's exactly the phrase that we used. What we said is we're doing a lot towards widening participation, and that is a fact. Peter can give you the facts and figures and reel them off because they're pretty straightforward in terms of bursaries, etc. Going on from that, bursaries, etc., are there to try and make sure that people from particular backgrounds are not disadvantaged financially in getting into university. What Milburn was actually more bothered about, I think, was actually things like differential entrance to university and this kind of thing. Now, this university takes the view that though we're investigating the use of contextual data, and we may end up at some point in the future working with that, at this point in time, what we think is the most important thing to do is to try and ensure that students from those backgrounds get good A-level results. And what we're trying to do is work intensively with schools from particular areas to make sure that their pupils do get good A-level results, because there is a genuine issue, I think, about trying to say that widening participation students are students who have less good A-level results. It strikes me as a way of stigmatising people if you're not very careful, and so it's not a route we're trying to go down. There are all sorts of other things that we're doing at the moment. So if you think about the WMG Academy, we're actually going to open a school just near Westwood School, which will be involved with trying to make sure, as part of its remit, that more children from particular backgrounds actually get into university. Having said that, this is a big problem, and I've got to say it's not a problem that in itself is lodged in universities. In the end, whether you like it or not, most of the difficulty is lodged in schools, and it's lodged in schools a long way back in time. There's plenty of research showing that it's kids really as early as 7 or 8 who are actually already starting to diverge in terms of their trajectories. So it's a big problem, and it's not one you can solve by simple solutions. If that were the case, we would have solved it.
Warwick's been making a lot of partnerships across the world
Mhm.
recently. Are there any more plans to either bring other universities to Warwick and onto the campus, or to expand Warwick further afield?
Not immediately. It's not a secret that Warwick and Monash would like to think that sometime in the future a third partner might be invited into that particular partnership, but we're not in a rush to do it. What we want to do is get that partnership working and working well. Remember, it's really the first of its kind in the world, and so we're having to work very hard at it, because what you do is you come across large numbers of difficulties you have to make your way through in order to make institutions from different countries work together as closely as our two institutions are. Going on from that, of course, we have other partnerships overseas, for example, the one in New York with NYU, Carnegie Mellon, Toronto and others. And that, of course, again, is something which is important to us because it links us up in North America. which is an area of the world that this university has had less to do with than it should.
Another campaign from the union is increasing contact hours. With some students experiencing just 6 hours of contact time with academic staff, isn't it unreasonable for people to pay £9,000 for such little time?
All I can say is to look through at the actual departmental level, and I've seen the figures for that. The lowest I think I saw was 7.9. I'm not saying there aren't individual courses that might do that, but certainly within, and if you look at departments, most of them were above 10, and in the Faculty of Science, most of them were above 15. So before we go any farther, I'd be a bit careful about giving the idea that somehow the other, there's lots and lots of courses in the university which are running at 6 hours, because there aren't.
History and politics do.
Not in terms of their overall departmental level, they don't. I've got the figures. There may be individual courses that do that, but in terms of departmental figures, that case is not so, because we've had to give those figures in this year for the website and so on. I think, from everything we can see, that we're pretty well on the Russell Group average for contact hours. So far as we're concerned, that's neither a bad or a good place to be. It's a fact, though, that that's where we are. You then have to ask yourself why it is, in some cases, that you do really want to increase contact hours. What will it do, one way or another? In some places it might, in many it won't, because there are many other ways of teaching apart from face-to-face teaching, extended projects, etc., etc. And you have to be very careful, I think, because if you're not careful, you simply ice those out in favour of a kind of school model of what university is.
That brings me on nicely to my question, actually. Where do you stand on the issue of online education? How does that sort of affect the university's future?
Well, obviously we're thinking hard about it. The good thing is we already have some extraordinarily successful examples of online education in the university. In particular, look at the distance learning MBA in the business school, which has been going for ever such a long time now, and I think is number 2 in one of the World League tables, and that is a blended learning course. That means a lot of it is online. We have other online courses, for example, teaching Shakespeare, which is done with the Royal Shakespeare Company, coming online, which is oriented towards teachers of Shakespeare around the world. So we are experimenting seriously with what we can do. Teaching Shakespeare is simply staggering as a course. You know, you go online, if you subscribe to the course, then you immediately see these extraordinary scenes acted out by the Royal Shakespeare Company with accompanying text and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful, wonderful course. We'll be doing more of that. What you're talking about, I think, is MOOCs and these kinds of things. I think we want to wait a while and see what actually happens, as opposed to what the people who are in the van of these kinds of developments say is going to happen. Because actually a lot of this is very unclear. And one of the reasons it's unclear is because it's quite clear that if you really want to do serious online learning, you can't just have a lecture course that someone can look at. You have to actually embed it in, for example, social networks of one kind or another, etc. That's actually quite difficult to do. A lot of these bigger companies are trying to do it at the moment, but it is going to take a long time before they get it right. So we're certainly interested. We're doing some stuff. No doubt we'll do more, but I can't say that we're going to do it very rapidly, because we're sceptical of some of the larger claims that are being made that, for example, it's going to revolutionise all higher education and there'll be nothing left except online learning.
Tuition fees at Warwick have jumped from roughly £3,000 to £9,000, and it is not entirely clear how that money is being distributed across the departments. Many of the students who ran for elective positions at the beginning of this year did so on a platform that they would increase transparency about where students' money was going, and generally there's a feeling that there's a disparity of resources between the departments. Do you think do you think the university needs to do more to let students know where their money they pay through tuition fees is
Yeah,
going?
though remember there are the annual accounts, and they're remarkably detailed. In fact, detailed enough that most people would have had quite enough when they've been through those, and they come up every year. And the university is actually quite financially transparent because it has to be. It doesn't have any choice. Commercial confidentiality aside. But going on from that, we would expect there to be a certain degree of transparency about this, but it's also worth saying that universities are entities in which there's always going to be transfer of resources between departments going on. There has to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a university. If all you did was to say, right, I know what we'll do, we'll put all the money that comes from this department into this department, that would be it. After a while, certain subjects would not survive. So one needs to be a bit careful about that. And we are being careful about that. There's lots of additional money being put in all sorts of ways. There's no doubt about that. And I mentioned some of it right at the start. That money's going straight into things like Learning Grid and these kinds of things, but there will be other things that will be added in as we go on. For example, one of the things you might go and look at if you haven't, go into Ramphal and look at the new lecture theatres in there, which are based, if you like, on teaching for the electronic age. I mean, in a way, most of the money that is seen as new by students is not seen as new by universities because, as Peter says, all it does is replace funding which we already had in the form of government-backed block grants, which was then transferred to students as loans. Straightforward as that. So we weren't suddenly massively flush with cash, you know. It wasn't like, wow, wow, wow. Okay? Important to note that.
The SU's got a bit of a drive on at the moment to try and find out what the hidden course costs are and how they can reduce them. What's your view on the course costs, such as books and things?
Yeah, we're working closely with the SU precisely on that. We take the point, let me put it like that, though we wouldn't necessarily agree about everything. I think our view at the moment is that there are some things that they're not hidden, because you soon find out about them. It's not like, wow, you know, aha, here's a hidden course cost. But, sorry?
I don't think you realised that when you first applied to university.
No, that may be. But we are trying to put together a policy with the union on precisely hidden course costs, and we intend to do that. And it's a bit like the Student Charter. We'll make sure that people know what is going on. Different departments do different things, and what we're trying to do is make sure there's a kind of rational policy between departments. So that's the other thing we're trying to necessitate.
We often hear about research-led teaching, but is it always the case that a good researcher makes a good teacher? Do you think that maybe Warwick puts research before teaching, because after all that's where the money comes from?
Money comes from all sorts of places in this university, including research and including teaching and including a lot of other sources as well. Yes, we do take a lot of note of research-led teaching. Last week, as in every year, I was presenting the URSS awards, and we have even more this last year than we have before, and we'll continue to try and grow the numbers of people that are doing research projects because we think it's important. And actually, there's been a survey done of people doing that work, and most of them enjoy it a lot and think it's very valuable in terms of what they do subsequently. There's a real survey done that was actually sponsored by VTI, one of the government organisations. We expect academics to be good researchers and we expect them to be good teachers. And I don't see the two as mutually exclusive by any means. More to the point, it also means that, for example, you are getting up-to-date teaching. Every year, so many things change, and you can decide what you want, really. You can decide to go to a university which will give you some sense of that, or you can go to a university which gives you a real sense of that because the people who are doing it are doing it. Okay? And it's a matter of what you decide to choose. But I would way prefer to be in a university which was at the cutting edge.
Your role description states both Vice Chancellor and President, and I was wondering if this reflects the way you actually see your role, if that changes the way you see your role, or if that's more for the benefit of these international connections that were made.
It was mainly for the benefits of international connections. Around the world, hardly anyone knows what a Vice Chancellor is, because most of the world runs to a kind of American model. And it was becoming more and more difficult, and so we had to add this subsequent couple of words on in order to make it clear in places like China that I wasn't vice anything, because it had become very difficult in all sorts of ways. And if you look around British universities, you'll see that more and more Vice Chancellors are adding this.
Careers fairs at Warwick are highly oriented to finance and banking sectors, whilst there are fewer representatives for humanities and the social science sectors. What is being done to achieve balance and ensure that students from all subject areas have equal career support or exposure to companies and opportunities? And is there a criteria for ethical companies?
So to begin with, of course, not all arts and humanities students don't go into finance or banking. In fact, quite a few do. So you need to be a bit careful about that. Going on from that, we try to make sure that there's a broad range of different kinds of firms that are actually represented. For example, one of the pushes we're making at the moment is for more small firms to turn up than have done in the past, which is quite challenging, it has to be said, but it's worth doing. And I think a lot of people feel that if more small firms employed graduates, we would have a much better industrial base. In terms of arts and humanities, what we're trying to do in particular, of course, is go back from things like careers fairs and think about things like placements and internships, which are a big part of this. Because if we can get our people into some of these firms early on, that's as good, if you like, as going to a careers fair. Your last point about ethical, I think we'd all agree that there are certain things which are wildly unethical. But after that, I think you'd find there's actually substantial disagreement in the student body about what counts as ethical and unethical. And our view is careers fairs are there really to try and make sure that people can get jobs. And if you don't want a job in a company that you see as unethical, well then presumably you're not going to turn up at their stand.
What's your view on the Council for the Defence of British Universities?
So, my view is that I think that British universities need defending. But I think we've reached beyond the point where it's possible to simply say that this is what universities were like and we need to go back there. I don't think that that's personally achievable. And I've said in many, many different places that what I think we need to do instead is to try and reinvent the university. It might have some of the same principles involved, but it can't be done in the same way. And let me remind you of some of the reasons why. If you go back to the 1960s, I can't remember the exact figures, there were just over, I think, 250, 260,000 students in the whole of the country. Now there are 2.5 million. To try and make out that they're all cleaving to the kinds of standards that the Campaign for Defence of British Universities want, I think is difficult. A lot of the students are actually there for vocational courses of one form or another, etc. So we just need to think about different models for different kinds of universities, and there isn't going to be in the future a one-size-fits-all model. I've written about this extensively. I've blogged all over the place about it.
There are currently little to no loan schemes for postgraduate study, but the government's looking into this. Would you welcome this? And considering there's no cap on what universities can charge for postgrad study, isn't Warwick and other universities pricing people who can't afford it out of taking on further study?
Yes, of course I'd welcome a government loan scheme for postgraduates. Do I think it's going to happen? Not really, no. If anything, I suspect that the government's already slightly concerned about the amount of money it looks like it might be paying out for the student loan scheme. The idea it's then going to be paying more money out for postgraduates on top of that seems I was trying to think of a way of putting it, enthusiastic. But of course, why wouldn't we want a loan scheme? There might be a European loan scheme, by the way, for postgraduates. There are straws in the wind that might happen. If there is, it will be for, I suspect, a limited number of students, because I don't know how the EU thinks it could, really have a loan scheme for the whole of all EU students. Going on from that, it could be, there is a concern, and a real concern, that British students who have a certain amount of debt of a kind will think, right, it's going to be very difficult to do postgraduate courses subsequent to that. We genuinely do not know at the moment, but there's a real concern about it. And that's why there have been at least, I think, 2, maybe 3 inquiries on postgraduates recently. And we'll wait to see what happens. In the meantime, of course, we will keep thinking about these things and try and do things about it.